Barbara asked us to, asked if everybody was prepared to obey him 100%. The thoughts that raced through my mind, which were rather selfish, was, well, I wouldn't be prepared to kill myself. So I had to put up my hand and say no, and my brother also put up his hand, and a fellow called Laurie Adolphus did. And Barbara then asked us why we were not prepared to obey him, and I said, well, I couldn't kill myself, and my brother said I wouldn't kill my mother, and I'm not sure, I can't recall what Laurie's reason was. But we were really put through the treatment. We were called up to the front, and I was fairly a self-conscious sort of person, and I felt most embarrassed by the whole thing, and I felt very disappointed after all the trouble I'd been to, because I knew that I'd have to return to Melbourne, and it seemed a hell of a waste of time, and I was most upset about it, really. And Barbara, when we were up the front, Barbara asked, well, if you're not prepared to obey 100%, will you try to obey 100%? And I said, yes, I'll try to obey 100%, and he did say we could stay on that basis, so I went back to my seat most relieved. Then Barbara then turned to all the other people and started asking specific people questions. I can remember he asked Bob and Lorna Rouse, who were just recently married, would Bob be prepared to cut his wife's throat? He asked, I think it was Bernard Bruford, would you be prepared to roll to school naked? And he asked a few other people pertinent questions, and you could cut the atmosphere with a knife, because I think a lot of people who had basically agreed to obey 100% realised that it perhaps wasn't as easy to do this as they had imagined. And I think there were quite a few tense people at the time. Of course, at the end, as Barbara normally does, he softened it and said, well, look, I wouldn't ask you to do things like this, but it's very important that you realise what 100% means. And then the thing continued. Other recollections of the Keele Mountain visit, and this is, I think, an interesting point on communications. At one stage, I was all together in the hall and said, now I'm going to say something that's not been said before. I want you all to record this down. This is the first time I've said this. This is an important teaching. And he drew some diagrams on the floor to explain his point and started explaining this thing, which is described in one of the awakenings, I believe. Now, the interesting thing about it, in these modern days of communication where we can all read and write, and I think there were quite a lot of reasonably intelligent people there with notepads, with prior warning, who sat there. Barbara explained this particular point very clearly. I can recall how beautiful the simplicity and clarity of the explanation was and what great sense it made at the time. And we were all scribbling down furiously. And after taking notes of Barbara's lesson, we sat around that night to officially get the official version. And there the interesting thing happened that none of the versions were the same, and they weren't just a little bit different, they were substantially different on points that were obviously major points. And the final version that is recorded, I don't think anybody has much confidence that it is an accurate transcription of what in fact Barbara said. And I just leave it at that, but I just make the point that because Barbara's teachings generally were about things that were quite deep and generally beyond the scope of our understanding, it is extremely difficult to capture accurately anything that Barbara says. So this is a lesson to anybody watching this film. Any of the recollections that we have are probably coloured by our own ideas to a certain extent. Other recollections that I have of the Keele Mountain visit were entertaining Barbara again. I know I had to play the flute for him, and at another occasion he handed us out various things to eat, and he explained how important it was that we had to catch these. He'd be throwing them to us, and I thought of all the people in that hall there, I was, as I said, about 19 at this age, and I thought a pretty good catch. I used to play cricket, and I know I dropped mine. In fact, Mum who couldn't catch anything for hers, so there must have been some significance in that.
Just fell into my hand now.
The other thing that Barbara did do at this thing was to see us all individually and have a brief discussion with us. I can't remember much about what he said to me, except that he told me that I was fairly honest. And that's about all that I can recall of that particular trip.
I'd like to add to the part where the boys went out because they wouldn't promise to obey Barbara 100%. Barbara then made me stand up, and he seemed concerned because my younger son was crying softly for some time. He even said, "Look, Colin, you're making Barbara cry," because it was raining gently at the time. And then he told me that he wanted Colin happy, and I was to see and explain it to him and see that he was totally happy. Well, I thought that's going to be a bit of a task, but shortly afterwards, Barbara was sitting out on the veranda, and I walked past him, and just clearly, for the only time ever, I felt certain with every part of my being that Barbara knew everything. It was an odd experience. I walked on, and just then Colin came up to me and said, "Well, Mum, explain it to me. How could you promise to hurt people?" So I opened my mouth and began with, "Well, you see, I think Barbara knows everything. And some of the force of Barbara, I think somehow the glance that Barbara gave me that made me feel he knew everything must have been for a while in me, because I said to Colin, I believe Barbara knows everything, and it was like magic. His face cleared. He said, "Oh, well, that's all right then. If he knows everything, that's all right." I didn't have to explain anything. He was perfectly happy from then on, and I didn't have to go into any long discussion about it at all. Just conveying what I'd felt when I looked at Barbara seemed to clear up the whole thing, although it had been evidently a major problem with Colin, and Barbara had said he was to be made happy and kept happy.
Beautiful story. Beautiful story.
My brother mentioned earlier on about the 1956 visit that Barbara's visits weren't always terribly happy occasions, that there was this tremendous sense of agitation and people running everywhere and Barbara all over the place. And the major impression I had of the Keel Mountain visit was that first day where Barbara hauled everyone up and said, "Right, you've got to obey me 100% or out you go." And I can remember the feeling that it was not just the feeling in the hall, the whole physical presence of Barbara was one of tremendous power, and this seemed to be terribly important. And my brother has described what happened to him, what happened to my younger brother. My mother's described what happened to her. Much the same thing happened to me. Barbara picked on me. He seemed to pick on different people in the audience and exact this promise from those people that they would obey 100%. Well, in my case, I wasn't prepared to do that either. But on the other hand, I was selfish. I didn't want to be sent away. And I was in a terrible pickle. When Barbara asked me personally, would I obey him 100%, all I could say was, "I don't know," and start crying. He kept on coming back to me, and he obviously really wanted us all to say that we would obey him 100%. And in fact, it wasn't resolved for me that next day, that particular day. He seemed to let me slink out of the place, having not actually promised that I would obey 100%. But I knew that somewhere along the line I would have to resolve this. And in fact, the next day when he had the family interviews, Barbara asked me again, would I obey him 100%? And fortunately, during the night, I'd been thinking about this and wondering how I could resolve it, because honestly I knew that if I wasn't prepared to obey him 100%, well, then I would have to leave. And during the night, I woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it suddenly just seemed very clear to me that Barbara would only ask you to do things that you could do, and that the most I could do was to promise to try to obey him 100%, and that's probably what Barbara wanted. So the next day when he asked me, would I obey him 100%, I said I Barbara asked me again in the family interview, would I obey him 100%? And I said, yes, I will try. And I meant I would try 100%. And he seemed satisfied with that. But I can still recall this dreadful feeling I had of being in a really tight squeeze, wanting one thing, selfishly wanting one thing, wanting to be able to stay there with him, and yet feeling that I couldn't fulfil the obligations that he had laid down, which, incidentally, I also hadn't appreciated. Well, I was only 15 myself, and I didn't know either that this was one of the conditions of the visit. The interesting thing, as I was saying, was that this effect that Barbara has on people, he stirs them up, he seems to get to the very centre of what their particular problems are. One other thing that came up during the family interview was, it was a bit earlier than that, when he had a few people assembled. I remember that Barbara was passing out gifts. He handed out hair to some of the ladies, little stones to some of the men. And these were very important things. He told us, as he handed it out to each one, that we had to look after this. It was almost as though he was passing out something of his own, something of himself. And I can remember then that I looked at these and I wanted the biggest bit, or the biggest bit of hair. Barbara made me feel terribly greedy, really very greedy person who wanted all sorts of things. And this was great fun to me years later, just seeing Barbara and being faced with the truth about oneself, which is very, very difficult. On the other hand, there were some things too. Another day, Barbara assembled everyone and then asked one of the Mandali, Dr. Donkin, yes, Bill Donkin, to read out the prayer of repentance. And then he said that he forgave every one of us, he forgave us all our sins. And I can remember the feeling there was tremendous. And obviously Dr. Donkin was feeling it too, because his voice trembled as he read out the prayer of repentance. It was though there was a great electric charge going through the whole thing. And I think everyone assembled there knew that something dreadfully important was going on. And Barbara was twiddling all his fingers and his eyes were flashing, and, it was a very charged atmosphere. And I remember that very, very distinctly. The other thing, of course, is that I, like my brother, also dropped the sweet that he was throwing to everyone. And I was very, very upset about that, because I thought I wasn't a bad catch either. And I don't know why I dropped it. It just dropped, and somebody pointed out to me later that in fact perhaps I was quite fortunate. It was my mother, that's right, because Barbara made me come back, and he also made Noel come back, and he threw them again to us. Well, fortunately this time we caught them, so we got our sweet. But I think that's about the most that I can remember.
A couple of other things about the Keel Mountain thing. Remember, Barbara gave us all something to keep when he saw us individually, and I've still got the thing that he gave me that you might be able to see. It was just a very small stone. I still don't know the significance of keeping it, but Barbara did explain to us that it was important for us to keep these things for a lifetime. Other recollections that come to mind about the Sahavas and the importance of it was that Barbara said that this was the last Sahavas that he would give in Australia. And I got the impression, I can't remember how this came out, but he gave me the impression that after this his work would be finished. And so that what we were hearing there had a significance in that it was the last that we would hear from Barbara. I can also recall Barbara saying, I think at this one, that Barbara never did miracles, but he said at the time he died there would be a miracle. And the interesting thing, this is just in my mind now, and other people may contradict this, I had the impression that shortly after that last harvest, Barbara's death was really when his work had finished. And I felt that Barbara had in fact died long before his physical body passed away. That's about all I can remember. Can you enlighten on that?
I can add to that in relation to Barbara having said he'd finished his work, in that when we were at the East-West gathering, there was none of the tension and the build-ups that were present at Keel Mountain, and Barbara just appeared to me to be radiant. But none of this constructive working on, and none of this power seeming to flow out that nearly turned you upside down. Just a loving radiance seemed to be the order of the day when we were there in the East-West gathering. It was a lovely experience, but entirely different to this working Barber that we'd met in Bombay when he was here in Melbourne and up at the 1958 thing. That is just my impression, that Barber was entirely different at the East-West gathering.
Yes. That was also my impression of Barbara. I saw Barbara again on a private visit to India in December 1964, and the contrast between the two Barbers that I'd known was very, very distinct. In 1956 and 1958 in Melbourne, as my mother was saying, Barber had this tremendous sense of power. He just seemed to be charged all the time, and I noticed repeatedly, as all our family did, the way his fingers used to move. He never seemed to stop, and his eyes used to flash, and he seemed to be knowing everything, aware of everything, doing everything. But when I saw him in December 1964, he seemed when I saw him again, he seemed still quieter, calmer, more serene. He had this feeling of an outgoing radiance, and he was certainly very personally interested in what was happening. He asked me about each member of my family. He was also still prepared to arrange things personally. For instance, he said at one stage that it would be all right if I stayed in India. I was quite stunned by this. It had never occurred to me that I would have to get his permission to remain in India. And as you know, we'd had to have his permission to stay on at Keel Mountain. And I was a bit stunned, but later on some rather extraordinary things happened, and I can see why it was quite an important thing that he had agreed that it was all right for me to stay. For instance, I found myself walking through the streets to the docks of Bombay after midnight one night with my friend, my companion, who was travelling. This is a very dangerous thing to do, a thing I would never do in Melbourne. But nothing happened at all. We seemed to be quite safe. I can remember one night we had to sleep overnight on a railway bench. Again, a tremendously dangerous thing for two girls to do in India, two young girls. I was 21 then, and so was my friend. Nothing happened. And this went on all through our trip around India, and I believe now that Barbara, in saying that he gave his permission for me to remain in India, was in a sense taking responsibility for me. And this is possibly why I encountered no trouble at all. Other friends of ours, other students who were also doing the same sort of things, who were silly enough to do what I'd done, get in taxis at night time, sleep on railway benches, etc., all seem to have some quite terrible experiences, which is what one would expect, the sort of thing that could happen here as well. I think that's about it.
Only this week, I think it was in Listen Humanity, I read about how Sadhguru can leave his body and it can be kept alive for a long time by the love of his lovers and be seeming to function. And for the first time it is occurring to me that that could have happened with Barbara, because his dynamic working things seemed to change, and yet there was just sheer radiance and love coming out from him on the 62 visit. Yes, I don't know, of course. But I just remembered that I read it and noticed it 2 nights ago. Do you want to say this thing?
There was one point where Barbara called all of my members together at Keel, having called all the females first. And probably with stones. He spread out a lot of stones on the couch beside him and said he was going to give us each a personal present.
Me?
First of all, he picked out a stone from those on the bench and gave it to Dennis O'Brien for the Melbourne group. This was very nice. Dennis went up and received the stone. Then he called Bill up and gave Bill a stone for the Sydney group. And then, like a bolt from the blue, he called my name. He called me up, picked out the largest stone there was, which was a beautiful piece of quartz, which had come from his tomb. And he pressed it to his forehead, was silent for a while, and then gave it to me for myself. Told me to keep it on me and keep it with me all my life. What the significance of it is, I haven't the faintest idea, but that is the stone, a beautiful piece of quartz. Thank you. Before Barbara arrived at Kidd Mountain, there was the usual kick-up. Different jealousies and stupidities between different members, which I've always tended to rubbish. And there was some funny telephone calls, backwards and forwards. Particularly just before Barbara arrived, when the telephone rang and young Bruce, who was only a kid, said, "You're all to report down to the house here in 5 minutes' time to be ready to receive Barbara." So I said, "Who said so?" She said, "Diana Snow." I said, "Well, tell Diana Snow to go jump in the lake." And he evidently went and did this. And Reg Patton came over and explained that it wasn't Diana Snow, it was Francis. There's no reason. I said, "Well, tell Francis to go jump in the lake." And it was a few minutes after that Noel told you, Barbara caught me relieving myself over the hedge. And I was still beating to the bottom of the cliff just as such. And we were all very circumspect from there on. But I could write a book on what's happened from there on between different people of the group. Anyway, there's not enough time on this film for all that faldy row. So I'd just say cheers. Yes, there was one funny incident. There were 2 tents right up at the top of the ground. They were for the male. They were for the male members of the party. And the Melbourneites were anything but holy-holies. Dennis O'Brien had a big bottle of whiskey on his pillow. I had a dozen bottles of beer behind my pillow. And there were bottles of flagons of wine and everything else. And of course the tent next door was immaculate. And then Barbara announced he was going to inspect the tents. Well, he came up, went through the tents, didn't notice anything, went straight out, and later on he was asked, was Kill Mountain to be teetotal? He said, "No, not at all. You're not obliged to provide it, but they can have it if they bring it." And they asked him, could Kill Mountain be vegetarian? And he said, yes, it could be. It's rather odd now that Kill Mountain is non-vegetarian and still non-alcoholic. But that's a long story. Anyway, the whole incident was, or the whole trip was just full of these incidents. People being paid off money they were owed and all sorts of things like that. I've taken up enough time, so I'll finish here.
When I was in India in December 1964, Barbara gave me 3 instructions. Well, actually there were 4, I suppose, but 3 important ones. The first I've already recounted. It wasn't so much an instruction, it was just that he gave his permission for me to travel around India, and I've already related the funny things that happened to me. The second thing he said was that I was under no circumstances to eat Indian food. And I thought that was a rather strange instruction at the time, but I agreed, okay, I wouldn't eat Indian food. Once, inadvertently, I did try some Indian food. Well, I didn't realise it was Indian food, and I ate it. And about an hour later, I had a raging fever, and a doctor had to be called and all this sort of thing. So I must have some allergy, perhaps, to certain types of spice, I'm not sure. But anyway, I think that's one of the very personal things about Baba. He does attend to you, and he seems to be aware of what your particular problems might be, even with things like food and drink. And I saw Barbara on the second day of my arrival, after my arrival in India, second or third day. I think the fact that he'd given me this instruction, which I did follow, apart from that one mistake, saved me from possibly quite traumatic experiences, because I would imagine I'd be one of these people that could develop all sorts of stomach problems with certain types of food. And I'm very grateful to Barbara for that. The other thing he told me to do was, on all my travels around India, under no circumstances visit any other saints or people who are renowned for their religious stature, or whatever you call it. I had no such intention of doing anything like that, because I've never been interested in anyone else apart from Baba. And in spite of reading about other people in India who claim to be Avatar, etc., they've had no personal effect on me whatsoever. So again, I found that a strange instruction. Nothing happened. I was never under any circumstances tempted to go and visit anyone else anyway, but I was told by some people that I was staying with in Delhi, who I'd related this instruction to, that sometimes people who are connected with Baba, if they're silly enough to go and visit some of these other people, they can have some rather odd and frightening experiences. So once again, I was very grateful to Baba that at least I didn't have to suffer any of these problems. I've already mentioned that I have 2 quite distinct memories of Baba. One is of Baba as a person of tremendous power and stature. An interesting thing is that I never realised how short Baba was. He seemed terribly tall to me. He seemed a really enormous, powerful, dominating figure. This is in 1956 and 1958. He just had this tremendous energy, and he's the most striking person I've ever met, and I think I'd be going to meet anyone else as striking as he is. In fact, I was saying earlier to my family just out in the kitchen that sometimes I wonder whether Baba was Avatar or not. When I say I wonder about it, I'm not really questioning it, it's just the thought that goes through my mind, because after all, none of us really know. But I've come to the conclusion, I came to the conclusion about 10 years ago, I don't care whether he's Avatar or not. He's by far the most striking person that I've ever met. He's the most important person in my life, or has been the most important person in my life. And the fact that I had such a tremendous childhood makes me feel that it's just not important what he was or what he claimed to be. I don't think I'll ever come across anybody with the same, who could possibly have the same sense of power and effect on me, on my development as a person. And to me that's very important, and I'm very grateful for that. I sometimes think, in connection with my own child, that I sometimes feel very sad that my own daughter has not been able to, or perhaps will not be able to meet somebody like Barbara. But there it is. I was lucky at the time I was young and time I happened to live on this earth. Barbara was around, and I did meet him through the good fortune of having been born into my parents' family. And I only hope that what I've learnt from Barbara, the things that I've had, I can pass on to her and to any other children that I might have. I think the important thing is that, in a sense, Barbara can radiate out. You don't really have to meet him personally, although one is tremendously fortunate if one does, and particularly as we not only met Barbara, we not only saw him, but we had several conversations with him. We were also put in very fortunate circumstances, for instance, where at Keel Mountain he said he forgave us all our sins up to that point. Yes, and he also said to us in the phone interview that we were all very dear to him. And the fact that he asked me if I loved him and this sort of thing, I feel that perhaps there is a very close connection, or I hope there is. I would like to think that. The other thing for which I'm very grateful is the contact with the Mandali. That, again, is another striking thing about Barbara. It's not just Barbara himself, what he was and the effect that he could have on you. The people around him are such extraordinary people. One would be very fortunate to meet any one of those people just on their own. And there they all are, all assembled, and there seem to be tens, dozens of them, of really interesting and wonderful people, the sort of people you'd go through all your life and think you're lucky to meet just one, and there they all are, all of them, all around him. So as far as I'm concerned, I had a tremendous background, childhood background, and for the rest of my life, well, I don't expect to run into the sort of experiences that I had then, and as I've said, I'm rather sorry that my own children won't have that experience, or at least I don't think they will, unless...
Well, you're not able to gardener. Yeah, well, as far as I'm concerned, I have the most hilarious of thoughts every time I think about Barbara. The fun that we had at Keel Mountain couldn't be surpassed. The fun we had. And I think I talked for Dennis O'Brien and for most of the fellas in our tent. Now, Ray was here a little while ago. No, not Ray. What was his name? Doesn't matter. Shut up.
Well, my daughter Cynthia was talking of her experiences and her sorrow that her... I was vividly reminded that at Keel Mountain, Barbara made a particular point of the fact that there were people not there, people that had not met him, and some who were closer to him than we were. And he made the point also that it was our duty to share with them, if we met any, everything that happened, which means that you feel inclined to recall the smallest incident as it may be of importance to someone else. And that, I think, is one important thing about this filming of people's reminiscences. We don't know who's close to Barbara, even if they've never met him, and what seems unimportant to us might be just the very thing they want to hear. There's so many little things. I remember at the East-West gathering, in one of the meetings, Barbara looked at me, and I felt he smiled especially for me. No one else seemed to notice it. But a tiny tot, Rada Rouse, she could have only been about 3 or 4, came up and said to her mother, "Barbara must love Clarice because I saw him smile just for her." And we were amazed that she had noticed it. There were other little instances that seem important, but for one thing, Barbara said to me, as he has to so many, "Be happy," which doesn't seem anything, but for the space of 48 hours I was supremely happy without any reason, not because of anything, not even because of Barbara, but just supremely happening. I didn't keep that feeling, but I know it exists, so that is an important personal thing to me. And there are some also that are not so gentle and loving experiences. I left Beacon Hill from the 58 meeting. Francis told me to go ahead to the airport, and Barbara called me up and he asked why I'd left without his permission, and for a moment I experienced sheer, not anger, but some awful, powerful force from him until I explained that I believed it had been his instruction, and then he took it away from me and turned it to Francis. But they were just as important as the loving and gentle things. So that's my further reminiscences, but I do feel they're important for others, even if we don't know how important they are.
I thought of some personal things that Barbara said to me, Irwin. One was after I'd asked him about if he had any further instructions for me, because at one stage of the game, Barbara told me to look after my parents. Well, I met Barbara personally after he'd given me the instruction to look after my parents, and by the time I did meet him in Bombay, my father had died. And after I'd received this personal instruction from Barbara by letter, I met him personally in Bombay, and by this time my father had died, and my mother was really quite capable of looking after herself. So I said, Barbara, do you have any further instructions for me, you see, and explained the situation. And he said, if you would help Francis with the work, that would be wonderful. And then he went on to say that he seldom gave anybody such instructions. And there's another a matter which I have remembered since listening to other people speaking, and one was that he told me not to have anything to do with men outside of marriage. And first of all, I didn't really catch on, and evidently to be sure that I did catch on, someone repeated it and at least asked me, do you understand what Barbara means? And finally I got the message. But also he gave Clarice some other instruction, and I don't think this is really terribly personal because it's a sort of general thing. It was something like this, that one might love another man, that was okay, but one must not act love except with one's husband. So that's the end of that little story.
Yeah.
I can remember one funny incident at Keel Mountain when Barbara asked or told the congregation that he wanted to be amused. He was to be told jokes and funny jokes. And so we all retired to the tents and laughed. Goodness me, I'd never heard so many funny jokes in all my life. They seem to get better and better and better and better. Some of them were a bit blue. And I said, well, Barbara won't mind a few blue ones. But nobody seemed to think that that was the right thing to do. I said, oh, I bet you won't. Anyway, I've heard stories about this from other parts of the world too, but nothing apart from the funniness of the whole setup occurred on that occasion. But the jokes that were told to Barbara were beauts, absolute beauts, and he laughed himself fully. That afternoon. I think that's all I wanted to remember about that. Thanks, Irwin. I can remember at one stage being right at the back of the room, looking round, and my eye caught Francis. I looked at Francis standing at the door of the room. He looked a sorry sight with a pair of khaki slacks on and an old green army shirt, and his pants were damn near falling off. And then all of a sudden, Barbara's eye caught mine, and he made a sign to Artie, and Artie looked straight at Francis and said, "Francis, Barbara says pull up your pants." And I looked back at Barbara, and Barbara was looking straight at me and goes like this, as if to pull up his pants. All this happened in a second. Nobody else would have known about it except me. And these kind of things kept happening through the entire morning. Little asides. And it didn't take very much to convince me that Barbara was something quite out of the ordinary. I think that's about the lot for the moment, Erwin.
I'm Lee Buchanan. I'm here at the home of my very dear friends from way back, Stan and Clarice Adams, in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm just trying to recollect a few impressions from when Barbara came to Melbourne in 1956. My first impression of Barbara, when he stepped off the plane, this has been mentioned so often before, but I'll just give my own version of it, was the incredible speed at which he moved across that tarmac. As I remember, it was raining pretty heavily, and somebody tried to hold an umbrella over him, and some of the Mandali and a lot more people were following him, of course, and they all had to run to keep up with him, whereas he was only just walking along quite casually. Then, I don't know now, just about a cut of a minute, I think, Erwin.
Well, it was a cold, wintry August afternoon when Barbara arrived in Melbourne, and along with a number of other Barbara people, I was standing, watching and waiting for the plane to arrive, and I remember so distinctly, as if it was yesterday, seeing Barbara standing on the tarmac with his little warm brown jacket, which I'd never seen him in before. And then Barbara came over to the terminal, and there was nobody standing at the gate to immediately greet him. And I saw this, and I quickly went over to the gate, and Barbara took me by the arm and walked into the terminal with me. Well, there was no fixed plan for arrival or introductions or anything, and I really then got quite excited and started to madly introduce people around me to Barbara. I remember one of them so well was Betty Burston's son, and he had a Davy Crockett hat with one of those long tails, and I pointed this out to Barbara, a great item of interest, but I was really just so excited. And then somebody came over and they said that Barbara would see us all in the morning at O'Brien's, and so that little gathering. When we gathered at the O'Brien home to meet Barbara, I can remember being so impressed by the fact that there wasn't even a fire lit in the fireplace. It was bitterly cold weather, and Joan had everything that you could turn on, heating the house up for Barbara's arrival. But when we arrived there on the Sunday morning, there were just the grey ashes in the fireplace, and Barbara was sitting in this cold room, and so were we. That impressed me very much, being very fond of comfort. And I can remember very well that Barbara called Joan O'Brien, who was kind of his hostess because he was staying in their home, called Joan and me out to the front, and we sat one each side of Barbara. And I can remember being so impressed by the fact that Barbara was actually there. And I remember looking down at his feet and thinking, oh, Barbara's feet, you know, and gradually my eyes travelled up his body to his face. And of course Barbara evidently took all this in because he grabbed my hand that was nearest to him. And of course that was very nice. And that's all about that little episode. That's all.
Here's something I might mention about this episode of Joan and Barbara too. I remember seeing Joan sitting there at Barbara's feet, and it reminded me of the story in the Bible of when the two sisters, Martha and Mary, were entertaining Jesus, and Martha was buzzing around doing things, and Mary was just sitting at his feet, and of course she was the one who he approved of most, apparently, so it appeared. I remember also when he was at the O'Brien's place, he was sitting on a sofa, something like this one, and we were all sitting there gazing at him, and he said, now, I want you to, whenever you think of me, just think of me as you see me now. And he just sat there paused for quite well, it seemed like a long time, but probably a few seconds, just to let us sort of drink it all in, and this is the way I always remember him. One thing that has always impressed me about Barber is his incredible, perfect flexibility. He seems to fit into any situation whatsoever. There was one other story I was trying to think about. And a couple of things about Beth, my late wife. When she first met Barber, when he first embraced her, she got this incredibly powerful perfume. Apparently he didn't use any perfume of any kind, but she sensed this perfume, whatever it was, something coming through from the subtle world, maybe, I don't know. And I believe that this perfume was also released many years later when the tomb caved in, and it was observed all over the compound down there at Meherabad.
When the earth from the tomb...
Yeah, when it caved in, that's right, yeah. Oh, and another experience of Beth's too, as has been mentioned, Barber came up to Oz and Beth Hall's place during the Sunday that he was here, and we were visiting them later on in the day, and Beth had a splitting headache. She sat in the chair where Barber had sat, and this...
Giff, Alston is my name. I'm at the Adams home at Eltham, Victoria. You asked me my first impressions of Barber arriving. I had been working on a Saturday afternoon job and went out to see him come on the plane, and there was a crowd already there. At the time, Stan asked Oswald and me to keep the cars of Dr. O'Brien and him warm, because it was a very cold day and they'd just come from the hot climate. So Oswald and I stayed out and were getting the cars warm, and we were outside the enclosure from most of the other people, and we saw the plane land and come down, and we just got away from the cars, left them running, and crept up to the nearest fence. And along came Barber striding in his white. It was rather exciting, I must say, because I didn't have any feeling of magic about Barber, but having heard of him for years, it was rather marvellous to think that there he was. One thing I won't forget at that time, he waved to the crowd as he was striding toward them, and he turned to Oswald and me and waved to us, and that really staggered me. There was no doubt about it. He did. I thought, well, he must know something. Later on, they sped away. They went away in the car. I remember standing with the crowd at O'Brien's. I think I felt a bit awkward. I felt like a ploughman talking to somebody on a different plane altogether, which he probably was. But it was a cold day again at O'Brien's when he had the individual appointments with us. And I'll never forget, I was as cold as anything when he asked me it was my turn to go in. And he gave me his customary hug and chatted to me for a while. And another most amazing thing, although it was very cold and I was cold, I really had a strange vibration. I did actually vibrate and I got warm. That was a most amazing physical phenomenon as far as I was concerned, and I didn't believe in any magic, I can assure you. Another thing that struck me, asked me, is there anything I'd like to ask him? And I asked him a question, and his answer was, where God speaks. He just didn't answer the question. That was the strong impression I had at that time. Also, he gave me a marvellous feeling of warmth generally. I might say after just talking to him briefly, I was exhausted for over 2 days. I was useless. Well, that was the impressions there. Now, do you want to know any of the impressions in Sydney at the later trip? Sure. When we went up to Avatar's abode, as it's now called, things were totally different. We were intense. Later on, when I went up to the place now called Avatar's abode, it was a different Barber, a different atmosphere altogether from that had been in Melbourne. Whereas Barber seemed to turn the warmth on in Melbourne, In Sydney, I had, at Avatar's Abode rather, I had the experience of being on test, and I had a strong feeling that I wouldn't be able to succeed in any test. I was trying to hide my head from seeing him a lot of the time. Strangely enough, I found Barbara's attitude to me one of, well, he didn't care whether I was there or not. I felt a little bit hurt at times. But there again, it had a most amazing effect on me later. I think that meeting did me more good. And Barbara, perhaps then, showed that he knew more about me than I had ever realised. So I think perhaps from that meeting, which I found unpleasant, came the lasting...
How did you know? I mean, what made you feel that he knew more about you?
And Barbara was working differently, for one thing. He seemed to be looking into us. I remember when we were all assembled in the shed there, and he was saying who would do anything. I asked him, and he was looking around the crowd, but I was trying to hide my head, and I know others were too. And I don't know, I just felt on test. Barbara was working differently. There was a different atmosphere altogether. I can't say any more particularly about that. It was like that generally. Even when I went in to see Barbara individually there, he didn't give me any of the old magical feeling he gave me at O'Brien's, but once again I felt that I wasn't meeting the test. And yet, as I remarked, the effects of that meeting have been quite lasting on me. I think of Barbara pretty constantly. And it's not a conscious thing. I think he just exists in my subconscious. Well, they're my main impressions. I can't remember anything else to say.
Ethel Woodford. Oh, well, does it matter about the Adams bit? Yes, I'm at Adams in Eltham. Yes, well, when I was at Keel Mountain, or rather, it should be before I left, I felt that I wouldn't be able to go because I didn't know where I'd get the funds to do so. And my husband eventually said that he would allow me go. So when I got there and we were assembled, the ladies were assembled, Barbara gave me the money that it cost for me to go. Yes, Barbara gave me the fare that to reimburse my husband when I went back, and I thought, oh, this will be worse than getting it in the first place, because my husband is quite anti-Barbara, and yet he received the money, and I haven't heard anything from him since about it. It seemed quite natural for him to do so, which was perhaps the most amazing part of that situation. And then when I was in the hall and Barbara was asking if people would be prepared to do anything for him, I know the feeling Giff had, because I was shrinking back in my seat knowing that or hoping that he wouldn't ask me this question, because my two children were in the hall too, and I thought, no, I couldn't kill them. I might be able to kill, which was the question he asked, I might be able to kill myself, but I couldn't kill my children, even for Barbara. And he kept pointing at me, and I tried to pretend that he was not pointing at me. And eventually I had to stand up and admit that I could not do this thing that he'd asked me. And he was very kind. He said that no one would be asked to do anything that it wasn't possible for him or her to do. I think that's the most notable things that have happened to me since meeting Barbara.
There was one other incident I do remember. When we were assembled in the little assembly room, Barbara asked, could anybody sing, and did we know any songs? And they started singing, and somebody started singing hymns, which seemed most appropriate, and Barbara looked sort of holy, and the several hymns went on, and Stan said, oh, come on, once a jolly swagman camp, and the Baba looked as pleased as Punch, and the whole tone of the thing changed. Started singing rollicking songs, and Baba looked very happy.
I was singing Holy Night.
Silent Night, Holy Night, that's right.
And it was getting slower and slower and slower. And Baba was getting droopier and droopier and droopier until I thought, my God. And the moment it finished, in a voice like thunder from the back of the room, I started up, once a jolly swagman camp by a billabong. Baba immediately sat bolt upright and started to conduct with his hands. That's what he wanted to hear, not to be entertained by Holy Night. Good God.
Do you remember seeing Jim?
No, I have no recollection of singing. I can vaguely remember being in Sydney, in the brick house, but it's all the material things. I can remember the atmosphere at O'Brien's of warmth, as you say. I can remember that strongly. I can remember the atmosphere. I've never before or since been in with a group of people that got along all together without any friction. And that must be something that's amazing.
Up at Keel Mountain.
At Keel Mountain, yes.
Initially, before Baba came there was quite a different feeling there.
Yes. Yes, well, you see, I can't remember that. I can't recollect any of that. And I can remember one particular girl that was very thin and did a lot of exercises, and I can't even remember her name.
Well, I'm Eve Syers, and I'm speaking from the Adams house at Eltham. And actually, I have very little to contribute to this occasion because I think I'm one of the lesser. I always felt I was one of the lesser members because I was never able to go away on these lovely trips like all the other people. I envied Ethel very, very much when she went. My only contact with Baba was out at Joan O'Brien's home, and most I can remember of it is that we're all assembled in the house, just all standing around waiting our turn and feeling very trembly and frightened about what was going to happen. And as each one would come out, we'd ask them, what was it like? And they couldn't tell us, but they were all crying. Everybody seemed to be crying. And of course, when my turn came, I went in and fear and trembling, and my impression was, what a frail little man, they had such a terrific responsibility upon him. And we spoke, I don't know what we spoke of, but I was very impressed with Erich at the time. I thought, what a lovely, humble, sweet personality he was, And then it just seemed to be my turn. Time was gone, and I came out howling like everyone else. You don't know what you're crying about. You just got so moved, that you just cried. And that was it. I joined all the others who were just sort of weeping and not knowing what they were crying about. Couldn't tell anybody anything about what happened. Well, that was my only contact with Baba. I can't remember anything that Baba spoke to me about, except that I felt this lovely, wonderful warmth and love and feeling from him. And resonating from whatever you like to say. I felt tremendously uplifted, but I couldn't explain anything at all. I was just uplifted. Because I always feel that I was not one of the intellectual members of the group, and I could never explain my feelings to others so beautifully. I could just feel whilst they could talk, and I'm still going on feeling and not talking. That's all I can tell you.
You want me to tell the truth? Erich said, is there anything you want to ask Baba? And trembling as I was, I asked him something that did concern me. I had in my imaginary ability at spiritual projection tried to contact Baba when I didn't know what he was like exactly. And I said, I have tried to contact you. Have I ever contacted you? And to that Barbara said, read God Speaks. So I just came out bewildered. That was the answer. I might say reading it wasn't very easy either, but I got through it. That's all I remember of the interview there. I do remember another thing that when he put his arm around me, I remember I caught hold of his hand and I thought, what a frail hand. I had a horrible feeling I hurt his hand and I just hoped I didn't. Anyway, I felt clumsy like a ploughman. I remember that very well. That's all I remember.
I remember when I went up to Sydney to meet Barber there before he came down to Melbourne. I arrived first of all and I couldn't get into the tent. It was too late and I had to sleep outside in a car. And I had a lovely experience which I don't know was real or not, but I felt that Barber walked along and smiled at me. Whether I was asleep or awake, I still don't know. But the next morning, Barber sent for me, and he'd ask, what are the arrangements for Melbourne? And I told him. And a little while afterwards, Barber wants you. And he came in, what are the arrangements for Melbourne? And so I went through them all again, and the third time this happened, I got called up from right down the bottom of Beacon Hill, and Barber said, what are the arrangements for Melbourne? And I thought, he's asked me that 3 times now. And Barber just said, I might ask you 7 times. And that was the end of it. The next I heard was when he came to Melbourne and started asking Stan, what are the arrangements for Melbourne?
Then when he started asking me what the arrangements for Melbourne were, I opened my mouth to tell him, and Francis replied from the back seat. He knocked Francis back and asked again, and the same performance went on. And every time I opened my mouth, Francis asked me before him. And there followed quite a traumatic scene. Anyway, he eventually got the answers out of me, and I think Francis was dissolved into tears in the back seat, but he kept, which reminded me that actually in the long run I did make the arrangements for Melbourne. Barber must have known this, and he kept asking me and wouldn't allow Francis to reply to anything. And he told Francis that now he was in Melbourne, and what happened in Melbourne had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with him, and neither it did from that day on, right up until today. I think that's the lot, Irwin. You fading out of that?
Francis was a bit hard to take.
I had a strange thing happen some months after Barber died, and I wouldn't have taken much notice of it, except it was very unusual. I had a most unusual dream. I suppose I dreamed like everybody else, but this particular dream was extremely different from any other dream I'd ever had, in that it was in 4 separate scenes. And each scene was different from the previous one, or the following one. The first was, I was at Barber's tomb, and somebody had Barber's body out there, and I was looking at it, and I said, it might have been, you think he just died, or you think he's still alive. But what I was struck with was that he didn't seem to be really dead. That was cut. I think the next scene, I'm not sure of the sequence of this now. I've never told to anybody except Clarice and Stan previously. The next scene, I think, was this one, a chap and I, it might have been Oswald, we were going to an old sort of a hall, an old timber hall that had a bit of a tavern in the front part of it. And we went to the back part, and I remember feeling really let down that Baba had gone. He'd left us without hadn't left us his message. And I'd never consciously had any feeling like this before. And we were searching through papers, and I thought, I can't find it anywhere. We went down to the sort of pub part of the thing, and Baba apparently said, what are you looking for? And I think the other chap said, oh, he's looking for Baba's recipe for wine. Blake said, I haven't got it. But I think I know what it would be. He mixed something up, and he poured me out this glass of something, and I tasted it. Sounds so sweet wine. Was insipid. That scene cut. The next scene was in a hall, and Baba's body had been dragged onto the floor, and on it had been put rubbish with a couple of old mattresses, etc. And the rubbish was about 6 feet high. And on top of this sat a devil. And I might say I've never thought of a devil in my life. On top of this rubbish, about 6 feet high, sat a devil. And as I just mentioned, I've never thought of a devil in my life before. But Baba, who had been, he was sort of lying on his back, he was dragged up, face upwards, suddenly raised himself on his elbows and dragged himself back a bit. And the devil looked down and panicked and disappeared. Now, that scene cut. Now, the last one, it was in a sort of a shopping area, and there was a round fenced enclosure, not very big, and the floor in the middle was slightly below ground level. And the people were gathering round, and I stopped, and there was another devil going to give a public performance of sexual intercourse. So pardon me, and he was a tall, good-looking, wicked sort of bloke, brown, I remember. And we waited, and the little female devil was just like a goat. And he was facing forward toward the crowd a certain way. She became linked up with him behind, and that to him, that was apparently the intercourse. But he was singing some song, was completely happy with himself in a godless way. And I thought at the time how attractive he was, but how cheeky and utterly godless. The devil, he sort of broke away from her, and he walked over to the right side of the little arena. And this little female thing, goat it looked like, was sort of looking round, her head going all over the floor, and I realised it was looking for Baba. And I looked up, and I saw the strongest flash of Baba that I've ever had. His strong eyes almost flashed at me, and that cut just like that. And that was the end of that. Now, I had no sort of after effect of this dream. It was light. I'd witnessed it, and it had no particular effect. And I remember I was going down to Mornington, I rang up Clarice, and I said, I had a most amazing dream about Barbara, and I didn't know whether she'd say it's worth telling. And she said, what was it? And I went through it, and I wrote it out for her, and sent it over to her. But naturally, I think of this dream occasionally now. I don't know all the implications of it, I might say, but it was most unusual for me. That's about all I can remember about that funny story.
Yes, sitting at Baba's feet when we were at the O'Brien's house, I can't remember a thing that he said to me, but it's reasonable to expect that he was talking through Erich all the time, probably asking questions and I even answering them, but I can't remember one. But when the interview was at an end, I remember feeling that I must have been hurting Baba because I found that I'd been clutching him round the knees quite hard.
He was sitting cross-legged.
Yes, I can. I felt how very frail that he was, and
there was an unusual occasion for all of us, I'm sure, when Baba seemed to have his own private meditation. He was sitting on a chair just outside the entrance door to what is now Avatar's abode, to where we were going to be talked to by Baba. He gave us, Baba really gave us discourses not published there, Anyway, he was sitting outside on the chair, and he was just sort of looking nowhere, and I remember his long fingers were there, they were moving occasionally, and he was like that for some time, as though he had almost completely left his body and were going somewhere else. We stood round him, and he was quite oblivious of our presence, it seemed, and I took 2 or 3 shots of him. I think somebody else took some photographs. But that was, it was quite amazing, really, to us. We didn't know whether he was being sad or whether he was meditating or what he was doing. That's all I remember of that. I do have some colour slides of that.
Well, on the flight back from Sydney, there were other people on the plane, and I hesitate to say whether they were affected or not by Barbara and the Mandali being there. It's quite impossible to know how Barbara's effect is radiating out to other people. For example, my younger sister, I had invited to come and meet Barbara at O'Brien's home, or I asked her could I bring her children. But she said she'd had enough of religion. We were brought up Salvation Army and she'd given it away. And she said no, but if she changed her mind, she'd come. She asked what time he was leaving Melbourne, which was, from memory, about 5 or 6 o'clock. During that day, Barbara decided he wanted to leave Melbourne earlier. And Dennis immediately got on and managed to switch the flights so that he left several hours earlier than had been planned. The next day, my sister rang me and said, as a matter of interest, what time did Barbara leave Melbourne? So I told her, and she said, I don't understand it, but exactly at that time I started to cry, and I'm not a crying type, as you know, and I cried for about an hour and felt as if something very valuable had gone from me. So I would hesitate to say whether anything happened on the plane or not to the other people that were travelling there, because you just couldn't tell. What else was I to comment on? There were 5 homes other than O'Brien's that had been offered for Barbara's use, and I had the job of writing and recommending which one. In the end, I made my recommendation of O'Brien's because there it would be warm in every room and everything would be done for Barbara's comfort. And I thought even if Barbara doesn't worry about his comfort, I didn't see why we shouldn't worry on his behalf if there's a chance of having something better, and it's very cold in Melbourne in winter. Well, Barbara wrote back and Money wrote back for Barbara and said that he had decided to go to O'Brien's, but it was entirely his own decision and that he would visit each of the houses that had been offered for his use and enter them. One of these was our own home and, well, it was a lovely visit as far as we were concerned. There was a little dog in the street that had been lost, and after Barbara came, he moved in with us permanently and stayed till he died. But first of all, Barbara wandered through the rooms. He asked to be entertained, so my husband Stan played the violin and Noel played his flute. Then Barbara went into the boys' bedroom, which was just 2 bunks, and the whole area was covered with model trains, which went this way and that, a farmhouse, and it was just a train room that they happened to sleep in. So I think it's been mentioned before how Barbara sat there, raised his hand and the train stopped, and at the back they said, it's a miracle. Well, the miracle was that Noel, my son, had his eyes so firmly on Barbara that any time Barbara made a move, he stopped or started or shunted the train. And then Barbara said, who challenged me to marbles? But that has been repeated by my son, who was an expert marble player but just couldn't win, even when Barbara gave him a marble about the size of a small egg. Well, Barbara went through each room and then proposed to go down to our sleeping accommodation, which was a detached bungalow right at the back. It had been raining and the underfoot was very wet and slippery and muddy, and Baba was in his sandals, shackles and bare feet. And so I looked at Baba and I said, no, it's too wet. And I thought and said afterwards, if there's any benefit from Baba going to the room we sleep in, I'd rather do without it than have Baba get his feet wet and muddy going down there. Whereupon Baba gave me the loveliest smile and waved his hand that it was all right and proceeded on to play with the boys. And that's as much as I can remember about the visit to our house. I do feel that it was, I felt it was important, but not as important as his embrace to each one of us. But when we had to have a tree out, I made sure from the tree doctor that it really had to go because